Greeting, friends. The pandemic has caused an unprecedented disruption in educational systems around the world, with total or near total closures of offline schools, universities, and colleges. At the height of the crisis, it's estimated that over 1.5 billion students were impacted by school closures. According to UNICEF, the pandemic is affecting more primary learners than any other group. The good news, however, is that some countries have already begun reopening their schools. And herein lies an opportunity with remote schooling and online learning becoming the main models for educational delivery. In other words, the pandemic is accelerating digital learning that has been gradually picking up momentum for over a decade. These are critical moves to bridging the digital divide, especially in the field of education. That said, teachers and students are still grappling with technological challenges, even as we appear to be moving towards a hybrid education model, similar to the hybrid office model that employees and employers are getting used to. Bridging the educational divide is easier said than done. It needs government support. At the SmarterEd Conclave hosted by the Hindustan Times, Union Education Minister Dharmendra Pradhan spoke about India's new order of education, the National Education Policy 2020, which is based on four principles: accessibility, affordability, equity, and more importantly, quality. He highlighted how this NEP 2020 will use the National Education Technology Forum and the National Digital Education Architecture to create a confluence of technology and knowledge. Now, this clearly implies that we need the participation of technology companies to make NEP 2020 a success. It's in this context that I would like to welcome Shailendra Katyal. He is the India MD of Lenovo, a tech company that's doing its bit to bridge the digital divide. Lenovo's vision is not only to enable smarter technology for all, but also bridge the gap to provide innovation to all. Let's figure out how Lenovo does this. Hi, Shailendra. Welcome to the show.
Hey Leslie, thanks for having me on the show.
My pleasure. Uh, So, Shailendra, I mean, these are tough times. I think the whole world has gone through a kind of a turbulence. Business models have changed over a period of time, and it looks like the education sector is also undergoing an upheaval. Something a lot of positives have also come out from this. But before we come to the positives, let's talk a little about how big is this is the scale of this digital divide. How big is this issue as such?
Yeah, so very valid question, Leslie, and I really like the way you put it in context that the pandemic has just been one more acceleration or a trigger, which was maybe something that was already in motion. Because as we look at the world over the last few decades, it is becoming a lot more complex and a lot more challenging for people to navigate. And as we looked at the world becoming more complex, clearly the education system also had to change, and different countries are at a different level of evolution on how fundamentally education had to evolve to cope with some of the new challenges that the world was facing. And yes, the pandemic has accelerated the motion that was already on. Now, when we talk about the digital divide, it comes in the context of a new way of learning. And the new way of learning, as per all expert educators that we work with, it's about being very, very student centric. It's about being a lot more personalized. It's not about one size fits all. It's not by learning by rote, which is what maybe you and I grew up with, which is to memorize and then pass an exam. It is about creating problem solvers and creating a very new kind of skill set to take on some of the global challenges that we see. Now, in that context, when we talk about a student-centric education system, or we talk about creating problem-solving skills, clearly technology has to play a very, very critical role. Because if we talk about not having one size fits all or having asynchronous learning, then clearly people have to learn on their own pace, and then you can't have everyone in the classroom learning at the same time. And that is where if you have technology supporting you, you can have people getting to master a subject, learn at their own pace, learn at their own time. So fundamentally, to support a new way of learning, there's no other way, and to do it at scale, than to do it with the support of technology. And in that context, the question that you asked, digital divide, especially for a country like India, becomes very, very important, because if you have uh, say one device per person to learn, we have 30 crore students, which is the largest student pool in the world. but only 15 to 20% of them have access to a device or internet to really learn at their own pace. So clearly, digital divide is a global problem. India is facing it a lot more, given the fact that we do have demographic dividend. We are the youngest population in the world, but do we have the digital infrastructure to support this very large pool of learners? Is the question that we have to solve for. And clearly, it's a large problem. It can't be solved by one company or the government alone. The entire ecosystem has to come together to support this new way of learning.
Yeah, I think you have touched on a very important point at this point in time. So, of course, we will require government support, which I will come to in a bit. But before that, I think whenever people talk about digital divide as such, they typically, think in their mind that perception is that, okay, this digital divide is an urban-rural divide, which is not really the case. I think even in the urban infrastructure, we have the questions of whether it's poor a power supply in many areas, even within, like say, Silicon Valley of India is Bangalore, but you do not have, uninterrupted power supply. Uh, High bandwidth is an issue. There are other issues also probably on the content part of it, whether we have enough educational content in Indian languages. So there are many other such problems that you as when you are implementing technology, you may have encountered. So can you just highlight some of these issues?
Yeah, so again, a very valid observation, Leslie, because digital divide can be a very overarching term, but you can slice it in multiple ways. So, at a very basic level, do you have access to internet? And there, I do believe that the government and the country has progressed a fair bit. Now, almost given the data point that you want to refer to, 70-80% of India has some kind of basic internet connection. But then to the point that you made, okay, giving electricity is one part, but how many hours of the day do you have access to, which is the quality of the internet access which comes in. So a lot of the country is still on 2G, 4G is still not fully prevalent. So that is a quality problem to be solved for. But having internet is only the first thing. Then what are you accessing the internet with? And especially in the context of education, if you have a smartphone, yes, that's a primary device, but allows for only one-way learning. And if you have to really replicate learning which happens in a classroom, somebody also needs to write, right? So somebody has to show that there is progress in learning. So from one-way learning to two-way kind of a dialogue, you do then need a computing device or a touch device on a larger screen to come in. So that's the second part of the digital divide, that only 15 to 20% of the country has access to I would say, educational device. Smartphone is there, which is a larger penetration, but it does allow for only one-way consumption. It doesn't allow for two-way dialogue to happen. And then the third problem that you said, right? India is such a complex country, number of languages, number of educational systems. And there we do welcome the government's new education policy, because it is trying to harmonize, it is trying to be in step with the modern pedagogy and the global way of teaching. So it will harmonize, but obviously it's a new thing. It will take a few years to really get implemented. But these are the three big challenges. One is the basic access to internet. Then do you have the right device to access the internet with? And then also, then what are you consuming finally? Is the methodology, pedagogy, and content really geared up for preparing the learner to be ready for the future?
And also, do you see some kind of friction or some kind of resistance where teachers are being introduced to this kind of newer model of education? I mean, of course, because sometimes they are challenged because students today are no longer the students of our time. For instance, I think you rightly pointed out that we used to do it by, we used to memorize things, rote as such. Today, you have people who have access to the internet who can ask the questions just referring to the internet immediately and challenge the teachers. Do you see that kind of friction also in this new kind of model that we are seeing?
Yeah, that is the starting point, right? Because and I would say maybe the learner is ready, because there is access to the phone already at a young age, even in the rural areas like you spoke of. So they have access to technology to some way. It is intuitive, so it doesn't take too much to learn how to access the internet. But when you have to train the trainer to teach in the new world, it does require a fair bit of reskilling. And teachers have had a tough time from whatever our interactions have been. Suddenly, even replicating, they're so used to using a blackboard to scribble and communicate their point of view. Now, how do you replicate that in a remote learning environment? So it has required a lot of reskilling, and but I would also see it as a huge opportunity, because if you look at the physical world of learning, the best teachers were limited to a single class. right? So if you look at the
Right.
demand side, there are a lot of hungry learners, a lot of bright, curious minds, and the best teachers now are able to talk to many, many more students beyond the physical limitations of a classroom. And that's the beauty of technology. It can make the demand supply problem look very different, which was historically confined to the four walls of a room. But does it require reskilling? Does it require a new way? And maybe the teachers also embracing this brave new world, that I'm no longer able to influence only 30, 40 students in a class, but the whole world is practically their oyster and they can influence a lot more young minds. But yes, the reskilling is required from the blackboard to teaching in a virtual world.
And I think also one important point is that basically, I think, remember some 20 years, till about even 20 years back, uh, teachers used to test the knowledge of students. Today, even students are testing the knowledge of teachers. Because teachers also have to continuously do that reskilling, as you rightly pointed out. Um, how are companies and governments collaborating? What are the kind of models that you're seeing? Are there two or three kind of broad models that we're seeing? Because specifically, of course, I know that Lenovo is doing a lot of work in this, but I will come to the Lenovo part in a slight in a bit. But overall, are there kind of two or three broad models that companies and governments are using or adopting to collaborate? Because if you remember, Dharmendra Pradhan spoke about this confluence of technology and knowledge.
Yeah, and the beauty is that because we are a global company, we do get to engage with governments and the ecosystem all across the world. We see a huge congruence because everyone realizes that solving for humanity's greatest challenges in a connected world will not happen by one country or one player alone. Everyone has to work together, and there's quite a bit of congruence or uniformity in how the whole world is thinking about it, right? Which is to prepare learners with a more problem solving or a skill based mindset. And given the complexity of the world, we do see that a lot of niche skills, specializations will start coming in. So this one size fits all versus creating experts in deep solutioning, deep verticals. Those are the kind of learners that everyone wants in the future. Now, coming to how the governments are seeing it, I think Mr. Pradhan put it quite well on the principles on which the new education policy is built on, right? Which is affordability, accessibility, equity. So there's this thing about inclusive world, right? So you can't have a digital divide if you want the entire world to move together. And somewhere almost all governments, including the Indian government, is making this almost like a fundamental right. Right to education has been there. I think it will soon evolve to right to digital literacy as almost like a fundamental right. It's as basic, and we did hear Minister of State for IT also speak about it. It is as fundamental as air and water. So that is where I think this accessibility, affordability, there's huge congruence there, where companies also want the same thing, right? That as you want the addressable market to increase, you do want penetration to come in with more and more affordability and accessibility options. And this thing about equity, which is where I think digital divide comes into play in a big way. How do we ensure that nobody gets left behind? And that is where again I see a confluence of minds there, where people do want to have diversity programs, inclusion programs, and there is one part is the commercial aspect, but almost all companies, including ours, are doing a lot on the citizenship, on the CSR side, to ensure that if people can't afford one, can we at least allow access in some form through the citizenry efforts that all of us are putting in. And we are not alone in this. I do see the government placing a lot of emphasis. Just as a case in point, right? A lot of state governments are giving laptops and tablets free to students, and that's been part of many manifestos. So it may be started as a election premise, but the fact that it fundamentally changes the life of the student and also the household the moment they grow up on a laptop with access to quality internet and education. So just to repeat myself, we see huge congruence, a lot of coming of the minds together, and not just in India, globally we see that happen. And even in mature markets, we see a lot of this effort of getting to the next level of technology adoption in schools. So there are two parts of digital infrastructure. One is at home, which is what the person may buy on his own. But how do people even smartify the classrooms? And that is also in country, we see a lot of effort that a lot of the government schools are getting smartified, which is very, very progressive as we look at the new education policy getting
And I
rolled out.
think the government has done a great job on the part of the of in financial inclusion, for instance. So we do have a model that we can go by at this point in time, and now it's just a matter of extending these kind of models into the education field, and
Yeah.
of course by taking cognizance of all the caveats that we spoke about, like increasing bandwidth speeds, etc., which I guess will take some time, but at least we are taking steps in the right direction. And I think even when you spoke of the principles, I think the fourth principle that we added is quality, and I like that. So at least they're speaking about not only equity, affordability, accessibility, but also quality. So these are
Yes.
good things. When you talk about Lenovo, is Lenovo as a company specifically doing? Because I know that you have some partnerships with NGOs, and so you're trying to do it at the grassroots level. That's the understanding that one gets. So, I'd like you to, talk a little about that.
Yeah, so we see ourselves playing an important part, but it is a large complex problem, and not just in country, but globally it's a big problem that how do we really look at the future of education. So we work very closely with the entire ecosystem and starting with partnerships on curriculum development. But finally, we'd come back to our core. Our core is that we are a global tech player. We are the number one PC brand in the world. So how do we ensure that we are doing our bit using technology? So first is you spoke about our vision statement, right? It's about smarter technology for all, and we do place a lot of accent on that last two words, which is for all, because we do believe that unless technology is affordable and everyone has a hand in it, then we are not necessarily solving for humanity's greatest challenges, which is one of our stated intent. So making technology affordable, accessible is a big part that we play in, and given our scale, size, we do have economies of scale. We do end up making devices far more affordable than anyone else can, and we do have the width, right? Very few companies can give you everything from a smartphone to a data center. So we do have that width of technology also to solve for education as a problem. So on that basic premise of accessibility and affordability, I do see us playing an important part. The second is as not just device in the learner's hands, but we spoke about digitization of the entire ecosystem, right? Finally, the classroom, the teacher, the educator, everyone has to get equipped with that. And when you talk about distributed learning or hybrid learning, because none of us believe that it will go back completely to what it was earlier, even if schools open, finally there's a power in using technology to give more access to students. So there we do have built some solutions as well end to end, because the moment you have a distributed class, security ends up being a worry. High screen time, and how do you still ensure that the social engagement continues? Those are coming up as worries. So we are creating all these hybrid models. One is smartifying the device itself, making it cheaper, more affordable. The other is we are smartifying classrooms, and I spoke about we see some government schools in the country taking that first step of smartifying the classroom. So you'll have digital signboards, you'll have teachers equipped with touch screens, and then they are able to distribute their knowledge over a much larger pool. So we do have those end-to-end solutions for smarter classrooms. And the third, which I spoke of, which is our citizenship, the fact that we are committing a large part of our CSR budgets to solve for education as a or digital divide as a problem. So these are the three legs. One is on the basic core hardware side, where we do make devices which are smarter, affordable, accessible. The smarter classroom piece, and the third is our citizenship.
Yeah, I think what I like most about what you spoke about is that you know how you're going to stick to your core and then help the ecosystem kind of stuff. And I think that's pretty interesting. But that's a good model to replicate. And in that context, what is your message to the larger ecosystem? You're dealing with such a big ecosystem of players. Is there some kind of message that you want to give out to the broader ecosystem on how they can what they can be helped?
Yep, and like I've said earlier, it will require a lot of collective effort to solve for, especially in India, right? We spoke about the largest learning pool in the world, but only 15-20% have access to a digital technology to learn. And even if you do a broad math, right, you talk about a tablet, a decent tablet with a touch screen that people are able to both consume content, and students also need to then communicate back with the teachers in terms of projects, some writing. So at a basic level, your tablet itself, if you have to give to the balance 80%, it's a $24 billion spend to be managed. If you talk about a device with a keyboard, which is what a laptop is, and actually that's a recommended device, because you have to replicate writing in some form, right? How do you replicate writing with only touch? It still needs a keyboard. If you want to give a device like an entry-level laptop also to all the students, it's a $74 billion spend to be managed. So that's the scale of the problem, and I'm not even getting to the problem of data connectivity and the content piece to be managed. So everyone needs to contribute, everyone needs to chip in. We'll play our part, and the government is I would say creating the right programs for companies to come forth. We do have the most valuable ed tech startup coming out of in the world, coming out of the country. So people do recognize that if at all the problem has to be solved for the world, India has a good crucible to do that experimentation. So ed tech will be a focus. How do we get more content in which is localized, more vernacular stuff coming in? How do we ensure that it is not learning by reasoning kind of skills which are important? How do we make devices more affordable? And the government is making steps for localizing manufacturing, etc., which should lead to that in the near future. And then the quality of internet. I think these three four pieces, if they come together, but it will require collaboration. And I think we are making these efforts. This conclave is one part of that, where we are trying to bring the ecosystem together.
Yeah, but I think the heartening fact out here is that we are seeing the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle,
And
falling together. I think that's the good part of it. Yeah.
yeah, and in our past conversation, you did speak about this not being a new initiative, right? There was this one laptop per child kind of initiative even in the past. But to the point that you made at the beginning of the conversation, I think the timing is right. The pandemic has forced us. It's been maybe a negative trigger, but I think looked at it in a positive light. It is now a positive force for good to fundamentally change education in the country.
So, Shailendra, I think this has been quite an insightful discussion. Thank you for spelling out Lenovo's plans to bridge the digital divide. We hope that many companies will join force with you to in this because it's a collaborative effort, of course, with government support. Our nation, as I think we all will agree, will thrive only if it gets a good education system, and more importantly, only if all have access to this knowledge base with the help of technology, something that Lenovo is doing. So once again, Shailendra, thank you for your time and wish you and your company the best on this journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Appreciate your time as well.